They put in the
That's buckwheat, and maybe this is.
So that's why it's a monoculture, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the Caltrans buckwheat and the Caltrans daisy. That's what they're called. I thought in Celia.
Celia Farinosa.
I thought, oh, it comes all the way up into Eagle Rock, you know, and then I found out that no, that's Caltrans planted that. That's good.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let's roll.
So this is Rick Halsey. He came all the way from San Diego to share his passion and his knowledge with you. If you do not know the California Chaparral Institute, it's a really important entity that gives voice to an amazing plant community that doesn't get as much respect as it should. And right now, Rick is on a wonderful campaign, among many others, to non-demonize the chaparral as causes of fire, or plants in general. So, but he'll fill you in on a whole lot of stuff, and thank you all for coming today. And you can tell all of your friends and neighbors who didn't make it today that this is being videotaped and it's up on our YouTube channel, as are all of the previous presentations except John's, which came to us in a format we have not yet been able to download. But it will be up there at some point, John Keeley's, which was the initial talk. So, and he's over at the other place talking.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Well, when I expect 2,500 people and I don't have half a dozen or a dozen, I think to myself, there's somebody in this room who is going to change the world because of what we hear today. How's that sound? Do you feel that way?
You are on it.
That's right, that's right. So I have a little handout here I'll give you about who we are. The Chaparral Institute started after the 2003 firestorms, which I'm sure some of you were alive and experiencing. I talked to a lot of high school kids, and a lot of them said, I was just born then. So, anybody that young here? Anybody born after 2003?
I spent the night on a roof of my house, squirting down the roof during the ones in San Diego.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we do research and advocacy work and education. That's the three things we do. And the advocacy stuff is some of the more interesting things, because what we do is provide a voice for the chaparral and the manzanitas and the wren-tits and everything else out there. And this entire thing that burned, when was this fire? 3 or 4 months ago? September? Yeah. So all of that was chaparral. And it was one of the last remaining stands of generally old growth chaparral that are in the southern coastal region here. And it was really tragic that it burned, but it's going to be okay as long as it doesn't burn in the next 30 years or so. And that's going to be the challenge, because the natural fire return interval for chaparral is anywhere between 30 to 150 years or more. And unfortunately, there's a lot more ignitions on the landscape because there's more people. And the landscape's getting drier because of climate change, we think. So there's adding that kind of risk factor. So anyway, even though it's a black ground, it's going to look devastating to a lot of people, but in fact, it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. The question is anybody going to try to interfere and try to get it to do something different? And a lot of folks want to throw mulch and seeds and plant trees and do all sorts of things. There's no trees there for a reason. Anybody know?
Doesn't grow trees.
Right, why? Anyone want to take a stab at that? It's really simple.
Not enough water.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's kind of a rare concept for people to understand. They don't understand that this area, the chaparral, is really its characteristic ecosystem. In the 1930s, they spent millions of dollars and planted countless trees up in St. Gabriel's up here because they just couldn't figure out why there weren't any trees, and these stupid shrubs were still there because they all got trained back in Wisconsin. And you do succession, right? You get your old field or your prairie, and eventually the shrubs grow, and then the trees come in, and pretty soon you get a climax forest. And they couldn't figure out why this wasn't climaxing yet. So anyway, most of those trees they planted have all since died or burned up. And the Forest Service and people in the local forestry community finally realized, gee, I guess chaparral is sort of what it's supposed to be like. So indeed it is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. You ready? All right, so we're going to basically talk about 4 different areas here. The history, which is pretty interesting. In fact, we've got some drought issues we have to deal with, and we're going to continue to deal with. What the chaparral is about, and talking about fire and humans, because they're intimately related. And then lessons from the Anasazi. Anybody know what the Anasazi is or who they were?
Native group.
Native group where? Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, an incredible population and civilization, which is no longer there. So we're going to touch on that. So first of all, what I want to look at here is some history, because it's really interesting. There's been some phenomenal research that has been basically connected with tree rings. And these are some of the scientists, that's Tom Swetton and Craig Allen and Keith Lombardo there. And they've been studying tree rings for decades. And what tree rings tell us is it's really wonderful. It tells us what the climate was at the time when the tree ring was set. So the thicker the tree ring, that means the more what it had. Water, right. So you can look at these things, and in fact, you can take core samples from old buildings, and even Anasazi ruins, and match those things with the tree rings that have been established before that. And so we've got about a 1,000-year history of weather in the Southwest. And here it is. So what this is basically an index that's been devised from the tree ring widths, and it's a phenomenal data set. I mean, they literally have thousands and thousands of tree ring samples in these labs. And what they've done is created this number that helps sort of correspond to the actual drought sequence. So what you've got here, the gray lines represent the actual data, and the red line is sort of smoothed out and made it a little more of a mean. And what this is showing you, there's year 1000 and there's 2000, right where we are today. There's been a lot of droughts and there's been a lot of non-droughts, and it's just been going up and down quite a bit. This was the average, most extreme drought level. So most of the droughts never got below that. That was the most extreme drought in the last 1,000 years. That was about 1580, and a very important historical event happened then, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I just want you to put things in perspective, because that's where we are now in relationship to the last 1,000 years. So we've got some major issues. There was a prediction that this would not be applicable to Southern California, but in fact they've done tree rings with oak trees. And this data is pretty much corresponding to what the tree rings say to us from the oak trees. So even though this was done in the Southwest, ponderosa pines, it's applicable here. We're thinking, and actually this is what's been happening, the weather is starting to wet up again, as it always has. And so that's what we're doing right now. We had a wonderful rain year, and we're probably going to have another one this year.
Well,
So,
what is the distance year-wise? It's kind of hard to estimate from here between the peaks on either side. Between when you cross the mean.
so between those two periods, for example? Gosh, I don't know. You're talking, well, there's 50 years. Or excuse me, yeah, 50 years. So there's these periods of waxing and waning. Looks like anywhere between 30 to 50 years. I mean, just sort of ballpark.
Because they don't look like they correspond with like an El Nino cycle. They're bigger than that.
Yeah. And things are changing. So the past is not necessarily the future. So that gives you perspective on the history. So let's talk about the natural environment really quick. And some of this stuff is going to be very familiar with you, but you may not have thought about it this way before. So there's 3 basic terrestrial ecosystems, right? So the first one is forest. Okay, I want you all to stand up. You can keep your papers if you want. Stretch out your limbs. Look around. What kind of ecosystem are you in now?
Dense forest.
A forest, right? You all agree? Okay, sit down. Okay, now look around. Now I haven't told you what this one is yet. Where do you think you are now? In shrublands. And if you were elementary school kids, I sometimes do this with high school kids, I have lay on the ground. What would you be then?
Coastal scrub. Oh, on the ground, maybe. Grasslands.
Grasslands, right. And there you go. Most people understand grasslands and forests. That's what they get. And if I don't understand why things are the way they are, it usually has to do with money. So how can people know about grasslands and forests? What?
Surface level.
You can sell wood and...
Right! What about the grasslands?
Ranching.
Ranching and cows, right? Okay. So there's this whole thing in the middle called shrublands, and nobody really thinks about them as worthy of anything because you can't make money out of them. And fortunately, I think about this often. For me, it's wonderful because I don't have to compete with the lumber companies. or the ranchers, even though the ranchers might be getting rid of this stuff, for the most part, most shrublands now are in areas that are relatively not economically exploitable. Is that a word?
Unless you got one reserved.
By people. Well, there's that too. And frankly, the grasslands have a dedicated space for themselves. The forest do, so I've decided that since shrublands in California are primarily chaparral should have its own special designated place. There's national forest, but unfortunately, there's not forests in the national forest in Southern California, except in a few places. So I've advocated changing the name of this thing to National Chaparral Recreation Areas. And once you get a name, right, all of a sudden you get identified. And as plant people, once you know a few names, all of a sudden things come alive for you. So when people start going into these areas and see, oh, it's called chaparral, all of a sudden, it makes sense. And I have to say, the LA Times, after 10 years of badgering, have finally gotten it right. And they don't talk about brush, and they don't talk about weeds. They actually mention chaparral a lot. So they've really got it together. It's probably the only paper that has, but that, it's like, turning a big oil tanker, right? It takes a while. So characteristics of chaparral. It's in every single county in the United States, in California. And it's even in this little corner in Imperial County. I went out there about a year ago, and there's actually half a dozen chaparral type shrubs there. So
That's a stretch there.
yeah. So what's the state ecosystem? It should be chaparral, huh? I'm working on that.
Barbara Major says it's the most abundant ecosystem in California.
Who says that?
Barbara Major.
Oh, good.
Barbara Major. You know that book?
What is it called? The terrestrial
Ecosystems
yeah.
of California.
Anyway, I get in trouble with redwood people and grassland people, especially grassland people. I don't know what's with them. But anyway, chaparral really is predominant system. So it's characterized by three basic things. Let's see if you can come up with them. See if you can give me one. If you talk about chaparral, what's the first thing you think about?
Density.
Okay, dense what?
Dense shrub.
Shrubs, and they're very special because they,
Woody, dark blue,
Woody.
waxy coatings, north-facing slopes.
yeah. What? Sclerophyll. Can you all say that word? Sclerophyll. So what's the sclerophyll got to do with anything?
Water conservation.
Right. So they're drought-hardy shrubs that are dense, woody. Okay, that's one. That's one. You want a prize? No?
Yes, he does.
You already ate the nerds.
No, I need county prizes. What's that? Don't start guessing. Do you want a big prize or a little prize?
I'll leave it up to you.
Come on now, make a decision.
What's a big part?
Small? Okay, don't show anybody this. So we got one thing, how about another thing?
Evergreens.
Deep roots.
Okay, we're done with the plants.
Oh, okay.
Done with the plants.
Dry rocky hillsides?
Okay, a little bigger, When you think about plants,
Generally steep north-facing slopes.
okay, a little bigger. When you think about plants, a big factor has to do with something about
Mediterranean climate.
right, Mediterranean climate, which is hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters. Okay, we're gonna say this together. Ready? Hot summers. You're getting way too serious. Okay, ready? Take a deep breath. Wait till I start.
Gosh.
Hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters.
What might be an exaggeration?
It gets pretty wet in the winter sometimes. Anybody from Illinois sometimes weird like that?
Illinois?
Where are you from? Are you from California?
No.
Where are you from?
Minnesota.
Aha! What happens in the summer in Minnesota weather-wise?
Hot and humid.
Humid? What about humid? What else happens?
Thunderstorms.
Rain.
Great! There will be none of that here.
Sorry.
Okay. So we're going to move on to this a little quicker here because this is kind of fun, but we need to just keep rolling. So you got drought-hardy shrubs, Mediterranean type climate, and infrequent wildfire. And that's italicized for a reason, which I'll talk about later also. Okay, so we're going to ask some questions here. Why chaparral and not trees? We kind of already touched on that. That's why. Not enough what?
Water.
Water, right. And if you take a look at the weather pattern in California, this is all based on different areas by city. And as you go up the coast, it's getting moister and moister and moister. And of course, you all know this. When does spring start here? November with the first rains, correct? Okay, I knew you were going to say that. And then it goes all the way to May, which the next season is, of course, autumn. And about half the shrubs of the chaparral lose about half their leaves. Isn't that what autumn is? All right. And then the next season is drought. So we have 3 seasons in Southern California especially. And yet we continue to brainwash our children pretending like we still live in New York. Right? I mean, what are we doing in November and December? We've got little Snowy the Snowman, we got the turkeys and the autumn leaves. This is something Theodore Payne really needs to work on as far as an educational program. Retrain teachers to put up boughs of scrub oak, toyons. I mean, of course, we don't want them to go out and trim them, but they'll, get these things. You should print all this stuff up and send packages to teachers during the so-called autumn and say, it's spring, it's time to celebrate, and you'll get people interested. Get a committee on that. Okay. So, very characteristic of the chaparral. That's found in 5 different regions of the United States. It's called different things. It's called the Mahi in the Mediterranean area. It's called the Fynbos in South Africa. But basically it's shrublands. So they exist in California, the Mediterranean, southwestern Australia, South Africa, and central Chile. Other than the latitude, what do you notice about where they aren't? Look carefully.
Inland.
East side.
East side and inland.
Inland, that's close, but that's not what the teacher's looking for. I thought I heard something over here.
Coastal side of the mountains.
Coastal side of the mountains. Okay, we're getting there.
East Coast. West side.
Thank you. They're not on the East Coast. And that has to do with the predominant airflow. Most airflow that's going across these things is coming from the eastern sides. And so by the time it gets across the continent, it's really dry. And that's why you have a Mediterranean climate, amongst other reasons, which most people don't really realize. And it's the geography and weather, climatic patterns with this is really interesting.
Can you explain that? Because, you just look at California,
Yeah.
we're adjacent to a big ocean.
Uh-huh.
So it's not to do with water. Explain again what.
Well, why isn't it on the East Coast? I mean, you've got forests there, right? Same thing here, same thing there. I mean, these are just incredibly tropical areas because the prevailing winds are moving the air in this direction.
I see.
So Rick, it's the little red bits on the west coast that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
I made an
That's
assumption.
a little hard to, we made the assumption.
Sorry. I'm glad. Were you one of those students in class that you weren't? You didn't know what I was going to say. That really stimulated the class discussion and got the teacher to get their act together. So many teachers. All right. So keep me on my toes. Any other questions about this?
So prevailing winds always go east-west?
Basically, they're called westerlies, is really what they're called. And it gets a little weird south of the equator. And I trip on myself sometimes explaining it, but that's the general
That's the
idea.
general.
Yes?
But weather moves eastward, like our storms move towards the east.
Right.
Well, we're talking global patterns, not, micro things like the United States.
I'm going to ask a maybe dumb question. Is
Oh.
that due to outer spins?
Yeah, there's the Coriolis effect thing that's going on there too. And you're getting deeper than I really want to get into. Yes, oh no.
So I'm just wondering.
Okay.
So on the southern hemisphere, the wind patterns are opposite, or?
Well, it's a reverse situation, but there's still this predominant flow off the ocean.
That's all, that's still Coriolis.
Yeah.
Because of that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be.
Right, right. Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So this kind of interesting pattern with the moisture and all, the way it is, sets up a very interesting dynamic where north and south slopes, you get totally different plant communities. You don't get this in Minnesota because everything's wonderful. Here,
Wow.
they get the same amount of rainfall, right? But what's the difference?
Exposure.
Exposure to
Sun.
the sun, right? So more sunburn over here, i.e. more evaporation than on the other side. So thicker stuff on the left side, like chaparral, and thinner stuff like coastal sage scrub, for example, on the right side, north and south Asian slopes. You can still get chaparral over here, like ceanothus chaparral, but you don't get the real dense kind of stuff. Do you have a question?
Just wanted to make sure that that's north-facing slope. That's
Yes.
not a north slope.
Oh, good. Thank you. Did you guys talk to each other before you came in here? Yeah, that's actually, that's a great qualifier. I think we need to fix that.
Well, and the other thing is that it's a slope, so in Minnesota it's all flat. Right?
Well, that's true. And even if they had mountains, it still would be just the same boring.
They've got hills the size of our hills. But there's also more moisture. There is more moisture on the northeast and so the snow retains snow longer.
Right,
it's
right.
higher and
So
all
anyway.
that sort of stuff.
Okay, so seasons in the chaparral, we've kind of already covered this. So basically what you've got here is this thing that people say all the time. We're back in Minnesota again, right? So I'm trying to change the culture here. So I ditched this and I came up with something better, and you can write this down. It's actually really, really great. Winter rainy days bring February bouquets. Isn't that great?
I like it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions about that?
Winter rainy days.
So, and I think this conflict between reality and what we think is happening is what makes people so interesting in California. I mean, you have to, you don't have to be too bright to know when the fall is in Vermont, right? But here, you really have to be a little more enlightened. So this is one more reason why California is there. So
Is that over in Kitchen Creek?
interesting. This is Indian Flats, but good guess. Okay, so how is chaparral diverse? Well, there's lots of kinds. It's not all the same. Here's a picture of red shank chaparral. There's some of this in Santa Monica's. There's a little bit between San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara, but the biggest communities of this type are down in San Diego County. And the red shank is a wonderful plant if you're not familiar with it.
Was that last picture of Red Shanks?
Which one, what?
The last Indian Flats one, was that Red Shanks?
Yes, in that picture, Then there's chamise chaparral. That's the most common shrub in California, west of the Sierras. People got mad at me because they like their western, what is that, big basin sagebrush thing, which is on the other side of the mountain, so it doesn't count. And chamise is, well, it's a great name. I was going to name my third son that, but chamise.
And some people call
Would
it
they agree?
chamisal instead of chaparral.
That's true. Yes, that was an older name, yes, exactly. Then there's ceanothus chaparral. Why do you think it's called ceanothus chaparral? Correct. There's maritime chaparral. You know where that picture is taken from? Look quickly.
More of it.
Mm-hmm. And maritime chaparral, basically, sort of a funny definition. If you can see the ocean and you're in the chaparral, it's maritime chaparral. But it's really more to do with the fog bank or the fog layer. And wherever that reaches is basically going to be maritime chaparral. This is in the Elfin Forest. If you've never been there, you really got to go. It's a beautiful preserve. It's right outside of Los Osos, next door to it, actually.
And where?
Morro Bay.
Oh, Morro.
And there's a boardwalk out there, and there's scrub oak and plants that are hundreds of years old. I mean, they're just remarkable. And they're all this tall.
Really, yeah.
It's truly Elfin Forest, if I can use that word. That's scrub oak chaparral. Some of this stuff is really gorgeous. That's manzanita chaparral, hence the manzanita there. The man doesn't necessarily belong, but gives you perspective. And then there's montane chaparral, which is basically kind of getting back to physiological structural form like maritime chaparral. It's very low and squat, but not because of the wind and the ocean and all that, because of the snow and the weather at the mountain peak. So you can basically walk on top of this stuff. And a lot of it is manzanita, which is what this is, and there's some ceanothus there. This is Mount Laguna down in San Diego County. So those are the types. And I came up with this 7-layered approach because I can't think in more than 7 numbers at a time. So, you know, CNPS has this whole elaborate process. They have their guide and everything. It causes me all sorts of consternation. So, I mean, this is simple. And that's pretty much what you have out there. And my wife won't let me drive usually on road trips, you know, especially in California, because I'm always, you know, looking at it, seeing this swerving around. I became, that was marginally manageable, but when I took some geology classes, then the road cuts got involved, and they almost took my license away. Okay, so let's see how good we are. What's that? So these are the basic chaparral shrubs. You know which one?
Leucodermis.
Yeah, leucodermis, right? Shimmy. That's, get this right now. Shimmy.
Is that also called broom?
No, I don't think so. No. Scrub oak. There's multiple species. Very interesting group of plants. What's that? Okay, let's see who the star is now. You ready?
Yes. Sugar copper. Oh, that's.
Gary.
Area.
Oh, you guys are good. Okay. So there's also a lot of fun animals out there. This is the wren tit. And they're pretty much the first thing you hear in the chaparral, and the last thing you hear at dusk. They have territories about acre and a half. They live for about 10 years. Yes?
They're on our Instagram feed right now, and soon on our Facebook is a little video that Catherine took in the nursery of wren tits that come every morning, and they're eating the last aphids on our almost
Oh, how wonderful. Really?
milkweeds.
Yeah.
And they're jumping in there and eating.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, they're wonderful little birds. Y'all know they're called? Yeah, we're going to do that together now. If you can't listen, I want you to know. What?
One more time.
That's really good.
Okay, ready? No, wait until I start. 1, 2, 3. You might get a mate. I don't know.
Now do a canyon run.
It's kind of the reverse, the other way around. Okay. Right there. There's a lot of mammals out there. This is the big-eared wood rat. And they make these mounds of sticks. It's a matriarchal society. The females pretty much run the roost. Kick the males out and they roam the chaparral with nasty attitudes for a while until they find themselves in new territory. Then the red rattlesnake, which is endemic to our area. It comes all the way up through here, I think, almost to Ventura County. But it's a beautiful snake. So they help control the wood rats, but they also secure the future of that plant, manzanita. So how's that?
Oh, they probably. They killed the stock.
How many of you know about the Arctic hare or the wolves and the elk on that island in Minnesota? Is that Minnesota? Yeah.
Isle Royal.
Yeah, and the rain. You know about the rainforest, all the fun ecological things?
They brought the wolves back in, is that?
Here's my issue here. You know about those stories, right? And the Yellowstone thing, probably. This is as compelling of a story as any of those things, and it's like nobody knows about it typically. So, anybody know? Want to take a guess?
Yeah, they probably stopped the wood rat from eating the manzanita berries.
That's part of it.
And they leave them. So like berries, maybe the wood rat is a berry. They,
Yes. Oh, we're getting there. That's closer. What's the berry thing got to do with it? Berry, B-U-R-Y.
well, the wood rat berries berries.
Mm-hmm.
And then the wood rat can't unearth them again.
Right.
Because they're killed.
Uh-huh.
So the berry has to go through a process of scarification before it can blossom?
Well, now the manzanita berries are stimulated to germinate by the chemicals in smoke or charred wood.
Okay.
So there's something about that too. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
You just anticipated this.
Hang on.
Right. These three species are intimately related to each other. It's not just this rattlesnake. So the wood rats cache the seeds of the manzanita, amongst other things, in the ground at various depths. The rattlesnake controls the wood rat population so that either, they never can get back to the cache because they've been taken out by the rattlesnake, or, they get scared or whatever. And that allows the seeds of the manzanita to survive the fires. Because if they're all on the surface, they're going to get burned up. If they're down too deep, they're not going to get enough of the chemicals that they need to germinate. So there's that kind of medium area in there where the plant actually interacts with this animal in a way to make it the right depth, and then this guy controls them to make sure they don't eat them too much. So there's a real interesting dynamic there. So a great thing to do is, there's a rattlesnake, what's that got to do with the manzanita? And it's this really amazing story. Tom Parker up at San Francisco State has done a lot of work on this, and they put fluorescent powder on little traps, and they had the wood rats and little pocket mice and things go in there, and then at night they go back and get the fluorescent lights and follow the tracks all over and find the caches and stuff. It's really an amazing story. There's a lot of wonderful arthropods out there. This is your Ceanothus silk moth. What do you think the larva eats?
Silk.
Tomatoes.
Ceanothus. Did you have a question?
No, I was making a joke.
Oh, no jokes. Okay. I have a friend, Kirby Wolf, who's the world's most foremost silk moth collector and expert. He had probably thousands of silk moths. They come in all different colors and kinds and stuff. They're all the beautiful moths you've seen probably in books. Anyway, he lived right down the street from me in the Elfin Forest Recreational Reserve. And he thought to himself, you know, someday this place is going to burn. I've got to protect my collection. So he built basically a silo about the size of this building here, made out of cinder blocks, metal roof, no windows, and a metal door. Well, anyway, sure enough, the fire came through in 2006, I think, and took everybody out. The houses, the landscape, and there was one building left. It was where the silk moths were. So he protected his silk moth collection. It's really amazing, yeah. So there's also a big mammal that used to hang out in the chaparral. What's that? The California grizzly happens to be on the flag. They dominated this state. They travel in packs of 5 to 10 to 20 sometimes. They stood almost 10 feet tall. They were the heaviest, biggest, most gregarious grizzly bears on the planet. They were really phenomenal. And as far as we know, they didn't really hibernate, and they didn't hang out in the forest either. They hung out in chaparral. How many peas? One?
What was it?
How many peas?
In chaparral?
Yeah, peas.
One.
One? You sure? Good. How many are yours?
Two.
Okay, good.
It's
Do you have a
one.
question?
You said packs?
Yeah, they roam in packs. And the thing of it is, we don't know much about all of that, because by the time anybody was intelligent enough to make records and really study these animals, well, this kind of represents it. This is Ed and Andrew. They're the ones that killed the last grizzly bear in Southern California in 1908. So, yeah, they would hang out, and there's really amazing stories. And of course, they're anecdotal, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But there's enough of them that indicate that they would group up sometimes. So there's so many of them, especially after the Spanish came and they brought the cattle in. The population of grizzly bears exploded. And there's a story in Tracy, what's his last name? Tracy Storer and the second author's Tevis, I think. They wrote a book on the California grizzly called The California Grizzly, written in 1955. And they talk about stories about the grizzly bears. And there's this one where, and it's almost like a Far Side cartoon. There's a bunch of them up on a knoll, and there's all these Mexican steer down below. And these weren't just the, these were the things with the giant horns and the bad attitudes, right? And the grizzly bears, watch this. And one of them would roll down the hill and lay on the ground and do his paws like this. And the steers would be curious and come over and boom! The grizzly bear would take his head off. Anyway, it's in the book. So there's a lot of stories like that, but they were ferocious animals, and the Native Americans were terrified of them. They're not really consistent with human populations. And there's an effort to reintroduce them now to the Sierras and whatnot. And I like backpacking. And I know people do backpack in the Montana wilderness and where Alaska is too, but it's a whole different world in California, so we'll see.
So they exist?
No, they're gone.
Yeah, but I mean, they wouldn't be introducing another kind of
Well, yeah, they probably bring one up from Montana, Yellowstone. So there's the last one in Southern California. The last one in California was killed, or not killed, but actually seen in the sequoias in 1924. So they're no longer around. And actually the skeletal remains and the skins and all, they're all gone. And there's only a few specimens of these things. And they were just so common, it's just amazing. So anyway, what ecological role they played, we don't really know. But they make these tunnels that the bears would use over and over. And they make these trails, same trails generation after generation, and it would be a series of potholes. Can you imagine walking through one of these and meeting up with this guy? Would have been really something. Yeah. Anyway, so they had a characteristic hump on their back. And I'm sure today there's still some grizzly bear trails out there and some old growth chaparral that has never been burned. And there used to be jaguars here, quite a few, as a matter of fact. The only cat nowadays is the cougar. But the reason I'm bringing this all up is because the biodiversity in this region was really phenomenal, even more so than it is today. And the one animal that was actually protected and preserved because of the chaparral contiguous backcountry stands was the California condor. And all these animals, that's where they live. And the condor story is an amazing one if you have never heard it. So there were 20 of them or so left. And they brought them back from extinction. Now there's hundreds of them all over the place. Yes?
When was the last jaguar here?
I've been trying to tease this out, and it looks like 1870s. Around there, there's some records of that. When somebody else asked me this in a presentation about a year ago, and this guy raised his hand. He said, "No, my grandfather, he shot one in 1952 in Oklahoma." And I go, "Whoa!" So anyway, and then whenever I talk about grizzly bears, somebody says, "No, that wasn't the last one. My uncle killed the last one in Sespe." And so it goes on and on, you know. So I don't really know. I'm not comfortable for sure telling you, but it looks like the late 1800s. Yeah. And there's a great book by Hiddle about Grizzly Adams, and a lot of it's fairy tales and lies that Grizzly Adams told, but it's a great testament to the kinds of animals that were here. And he noted jaguars quite frequently. So let's get on to basics about fire, which is kind of why we're here today. Before I do that, any questions about the biological stuff, animals or the plants? Okay. So every ecosystem has its own kind of fire regime, and you probably know this. There's surface fires and there's crown fires. Surface fires happen in these forests, not all, but some forests. And this is the fire everybody dreams about when you hear about fires and things, because, and again, like I told you, it's always about money. These surface fires don't burn up the thing they want to make money from, which is the trees, okay. Ponderosa pine forests in the southwest are typically this kind of forest where the fire stays in the ground, doesn't get up into the crown, which is what crown means, and just scars the trees. And you can ride a horse or a Cadillac through these things. They ride everything. Now, crown fires are when the fire takes out the whole system. And that's what you have in chaparral. And you can see what happened here in the Cayugos. That's perfectly natural, perfectly normal. But the mantra is, oh my gosh, it was so severe, so intense, so unnatural. It sterilized the soil. It created a hydrophobic layer. The whole mountain's going to come into my backyard. I mean, the whole thing. It's repeated every single fire. And for the most part, it's just totally bogus. I mean, I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a perfectly natural event in shrublands because you can't really have a ground fire in shrublands. Why not?
There's no ground.
There's no ground. I mean, you've got all these sticks. It's physically impossible to have that. Yet, the paradigm is so embedded in the forestry community. I've had people telling me we need to reintroduce surface fires in chaparral so we don't have such intense fires. It's physically impossible. But you know how people are. They dream a lot of weird things. So anyway, there's forests that have crown fires too. The lodgepole pine forest in the Rocky Mountains. Their fire return interval is anywhere between 150 to 300 something years, depending on the elevation. The Yellowstone fires, that was a perfectly normal event. People lost their jobs and heads rolled because people wanted to make somebody accountable, and in fact, that was a perfectly natural event. Okay, so to emphasize this is a dense chaparral stand. Here's what happens when you have a crown fire. Same place, same kid? He resprouted. You want to see that again? Okay, here we go. This manzanita here, this is Xylococcus bicolor. This is over here to the right a little bit, but anyway, there you go.
Oh, yeah.
So this is pretty much what it looks like up on the mountains, doesn't it?
If this had been a surface fire, can you point to where the actual fire would take place then?
What, say again?
If this had been a surface
Oh!
fire, which it's not, would it be like an inch off the ground?
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody do this. Put your hands up. This one is go. That's a surface fire. Okay, ready? Hands up. Ready? Go. Yeah, surface fires maybe 1 to 2 to 3 feet. Ground fires as far as they can go. You know. All right. So being dense and penetrable and prone to huge, infrequent, large, high-intensity fires is the natural condition of chaparral. It's not the fault of firefighters or environmental laws. You hear this all the time. You hear this all the time.
I got a call this week,
Yeah,
but on a survey,
yeah.
all about the fires up north.
Oh.
And who to blame
Yeah.
for those fires.
Well, I know who to blame, but that's another issue. So just to get some clarity here, there's a lot of words people use interchangeably. Intensity, high intensity fires really relates to the amount of heat the fire is giving off. And severity, high severity. Hello, why are you late?
Sorry, it's a long story.
Okay.
She's our volunteer videographer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, but I forgot.
Oh, you'll cut the wrong thing in the wrong place. So high severity means the amount of above ground material that's been burned off. So that's sort of the distinction. And a lot of people have different definitions, but those are really the real definitions. And they're not interchangeable.
In reality, high severity means how many things that people value money-wise.
Yes, and that's primarily having to do with lumber and trees. And I have a hard time with severity in chaparral because it's, you know, it implies, for some people, death of the material above ground. When in fact, that doesn't happen in chaparral. It scarifies the seeds. There's a lot of resprouters, so it's anything but a death-inducing event. So this mythology persists, and I want to address this a little bit in reference to the fires up north. So here was a headline in the High Country News, which should know better. Drought-choked wildlands play a role in California fires. All right, I mean, they can argue we sort of qualified that, played a role, but really what the people read when they read this is what? These evil, shrub-choked environments, right? And they were there because firefighters snuffed out all these evil fires. Well, why would firefighters want to do that? Maybe to save lives and property? I am so annoyed with this continual refrain. And what you're really telling the fire departments is, you shouldn't be doing this. You're creating a horrible problem. Stop trying to protect us. So it's a ridiculous monologue, and it just goes on and on and on. So let's take a look at this actual choked environment with shrubs, you know, going and grabbing people and pulling them into the shrubbery. What do you see here?
Subdivisions.
Subdivisions, grasslands. There's some of the evil oaks and the shrubs in here, trying to reach out and grab people. Here's the fire that came through. That's not a shrub anything. It's a mosaic of grasslands, conifer forest, oak woodlands, chaparral. Yeah, chaparral burn. It played a role. Well, so did some trash on the corner of the street, you know? So the issue is, what was fueling these fires? Houses, grasses, trees, shrubs. So to narrow in on this one thing to reinforce pejorative kind of derogatory commentary about our native ecosystem is just not helpful.
Fire department did a real good job on the top there.
Well, yeah. You know, when I put this together, I thought about changing that, but anyway. So this is about 5 miles. And that's a big chunk of the fire. It's the lower portion. But anyway, so it's a whole mosaic, and for the most part, from what I can see, it's grasslands. So they should have had grasslands play a role. You know, grassy, choked grasslands. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
Open spaces.
Yeah. Grass-choked open spaces.
How about house choke maybe?
Yeah, well, there you go. So anyway, these are the choky shrubs that are choking the children as they crawl through it. I mean, it's just the natural system, see, and that's the thing that I try to pound home with reporters and people who confront me with this thing. But it's a convenient story, and it's continually propelled in the media all the time. Do you have a question?
Well, it was also the wind, right? I mean, the wind, there hadn't...
Yes. There were 78-mile wind gusts, and in those kind of fires, which we've had here, the old fire in 2003, I mean, all fire people can do is get people out of the way. There's no putting out those fires. And those fires go out when they want to go out. Either they hit the ocean, it rains, or it gets so far into community, there's nothing left but concrete. So, you know, the fire service is really on a triage kind of program where they're trying to protect lives and property. And then, of course, they get blamed for not, you know, throwing the helicopters up at 70-mile-an-hour winds and, you know, at night and all those kind of things. So it gets to the blame game that you were talking about. Yes? Oh.
Don't the fires create winds?
Well, people say that, and this is another thing in the news media. You create your own weather. Well, okay, you got hot fires, and also they say fire's really hot. This is a new concept to me when I first started reading the papers. You know, and it was hot enough to melt aluminum. Yeah, that's what happens. But you know, the hyperbole is just, it gets to the point where, you know, people really create images to themselves. I mean, Thursday night, a lady started arguing with me about how houses explode in these fires. Unless they're filled with gasoline or they got a propane in the bathroom tank, you know, no, they just burn. You know, and they burn really fast sometimes, but... Right, so another headline which came out, sudden oak death likely exacerbated deadly Northern California fires. There's an oak tree, kind of a pretty dead oak tree. I don't know whether it died from sudden oak death, but I thought I'd throw it in there. Let's take a look at the landscape that burned, all right? That these oak trees supposedly played an important role. All right, this is the research that's out there identifying the trees that have died from sudden oak death. They're the red ones, and these are single trees. The green ones didn't have any sudden oak death. Okay, you want to revisit that headline again? Sudden oak death likely exacerbated deadly California. Okay, yeah, there's 4 of them. That definitely turned it into an inferno. And here's the crazy thing. Here's the crazy thing. In this article, look at the quote. So it's just like, people want to believe things and they want the headlines to be what, and it just perpetuates mythology all the time. And it's so frustrating when the information is actually so interesting and it can actually help people protect their communities. All right, so let's get back to the natural environment. So too many fires basically means no chaparral, and that's an issue we need to be aware of. Any fires more frequent than once every 30 years, you're starting to look for trouble. This whole area got burned in 1970. The middle section all the way to the back got burned in 2001. And this front section got burned in 2003. That's too short of a time period for the chaparral to recover. Why? Anybody want to speculate why?
Lose your seed bank and you kill your crowns.
Yeah, there's not enough time for the plants to mature to produce seed to put them in the soil. There's that. And then you answered it with two answers. That was really unfair. Okay, the second thing is the root crowns that are underground. They need time to restore their starch supplies. And so, just as they're coming up and resprouting, they get hammered again, they end up dying. And in fact, these are chamise shrubs, and they're usually pretty resilient. They're gone there. In fact, I went back a couple years ago, and the chamise there are just almost like they're handicapped or something. They're just really, and there's nothing there but dirt. 2 years ago, because we had a drought. There wasn't even any grasses anymore. It was really an amazing scene. So anyway, basically fires occurring below that sort of realm, 15 to 20 years, you're really asking for trouble. Leads to a bunch of things. Reduced biodiversity. There's not much life here, for the most part. Watershed function, you know, in terms of water percolating into the water, it can't just into the soil. It can't just hit the ground and then soak in. If it hits the ground really quickly, it's going to cause a lot of flooding. Weedy grasslands, that's called type conversion. Increased fire risk, the more of these, the easier it is to ignite things. And then, of course, nature gets pretty much covered. So this story is a common one throughout Southern California. This is a map put together by the Forest Service. And the hot colors represent areas that have more fire than the system can basically tolerate. The blue areas are areas that have probably missed some fire cycles, that probably could use some more fire. But you don't ever hear this story. This is the story you hear all the time. Because people have a hard time juggling more than one idea at a time in their head. So they want to apply some major story to the whole world. So that's what's going on. And I got into a discussion with a fire official up in the northern part of the state recently, and well, actually it was about 5 years ago. He was getting really annoyed with my commentary and said, well, you know, we don't have fires like that here, and you know, San Diego's different. I said, well, just wait. Southern California's heading north, and that's exactly what's going on. Santa Barbara, which has dodged the bullet for so long, they've had multiple fires, one after the other up there. And one of them had happened about a year ago on the other side of the San Ynez Mountains. Actually, is type converting a very large area because the fire hit an area that had just burned recently. So they're starting to see that there. So it's best to think chaparral is adapted to a particular fire pattern, not fires per se. So, and there's all sorts of ways plants respond to fires. There's your obligate cedars, and what does that mean? Anybody know? Stop yawning.
They're not crown spreading.
What?
They're not crown spreading.
They're not crown spreading. The plant dies and recovers by seeding. So this is the ceanothus. Ceanothus recover by seeding. Their seeds get stimulated by the heat, and which modifies the seed coat, which allows what to get in? Water, right. There's obligate resprouters. What are those? They're the resprouters. These are big seeded plants typically. Scrub oak, toyon, that kind of thing, hollow leaf cherry. The seeds get burned up in the fire or have been eaten up by animals or have rotted away. And then you get these confused plants, which are the facultative seeders, and they do both, right? They resprout and they seed. A classic example of that is shimi's. So there's all sorts of other fun things that happen. But once you get out there and start looking around, post-fire environments with chaparral are really amazing. Yes?
The circulative cedars, are those more, is that a better strategy for plants?
Well, you know, that's a great question. Evolution is such an amazing thing. I mean, why wouldn't everybody want to do that, I would think? And I don't know the answer to that. Sometimes evolution is not necessarily logical, it's just sort of random and things happen because they work.
Yeah,
and I
always,
huh?
it's always that.
Yeah, I think probably. I mean, people, I ask, when I talk to kids, I say, why do dogs wag their tails? Because they're happy. I said, well, no, we killed the ones that didn't. So, yeah. So it's the same thing here. I mean, it's not that these plants learn to adapt to fire, or they're adapted to fire.
I don't 2 years old?
No, these are kindergartners. Is that too young? I was a high school teacher, so it's okay.
That's awesome.
But you know, these plants that have, they're the ones that happen to have these behaviors, these strategies, than the ones who aren't around anymore. So it's not necessarily they, you know, gosh, there's a fire, we better adapt. Either they kind of had the pre-adaptations, but they didn't. And then when things went on, just continue to exaggerate this. Okay, you guys need to get under control here. Are we done with the coffee? Or no, it's okay. Because that took you a long time last time. You were gone for like 5 minutes. You'll miss so much.
Fresh made.
I can do it faster than
That's okay. Okay, let's jump to the human environment now. So before I do that, I want everybody to stand up for a minute, because I have a period of meagerment. It's called the 3-yawn measurement. If I see 3 yawns in a group, we do a little exercise. So we're gonna be at a condor, because we talked about condors. So if we can spread our wings out a little bit, there you go, and soar a little bit. There you go. All right, now you be a scrub jay, flap your wings a little faster. There you go. You just come on. There we go. All right, and then do a hummingbird. Go. Okay, sit down now. Okay, I want you all to know, not only is it questionable about getting a mate as a wren tit, but you would be lousy birds, because birds fly like this. I don't know if you know that. Anyway, you guys have a lot to learn here. At the Theater of Pain Foundation. So these are the fires that happened in Northern California this last October. They're devastating, before I show you these pictures, just be prepared. They're not pleasant. If you want to really get a feeling for what happened up there, go on Google Earth, and they've got the burned landscape already up with the houses, and they did it right now. And this is the first time I've seen this kind of thing. And just look at the Fountain Grove neighborhood, which is to the east of Santa Rosa, which I'm going to show you here in a minute. And then toggle back and forth with the timeline to what it was before, and just start roaming around. I mean, there were just incredibly beautiful homes, well-manicured homes, homes in the middle of nowhere, homes in the middle of suburbia, homes with defensible space, homes with not, and the families and the people that were impacted by this fire, I can't even imagine. We're talking 8,000 homes.
1 out of 20.
What's that?
1 out of 20.
It's amazing. So here's a quote that was in the newspaper. It was in that same High Country Times thing. Before the California wine country fires roared through vineyards and neighborhoods, they first blazed in the forests and the shrublands. There's those shrublands again. They started well into the wildland areas and then burned into heavily populated areas, places people would never have expected wildfires to come through. Well, they should have. Let's look at where this fire started, in the wildlands, far from any kind of neighborhoods. See the little red mark there that just popped up? Let's see it again. There you go. Now let's take a look at this wildland area. It started in the vineyards and the roads where the weeds are. And yeah, there's a patch of wildland area. But, again, it's a reference to nature. It's not a good thing. We got to get rid of it. I mean, that's the subtle message that these headlines continually crank out. They're not saying that, but that's the message that's coming across. This is where fires start. It's very common. This is a map of the Cleveland National Forest. These are the fire starts in that time period. What do you notice?
There's a lot of
freeway.
Yeah, it's following the freeway. And there's some other starts, of course, everywhere, but if we could solve the freeway ignition problem, we'd be far ahead of it. And the big fire that happened, the spring fire in the Santa Monica Mountains, happened right where that pass is, where the big trucks are coming up the hill from the Cambria, and they're and kicking out the stuff out of the back. And there's a place on the roadside where you can see where the spark hit. And what did it hit? It didn't hit the shrubs, it hit the grasses that were dry. Perfect kindling. So fires are more destructive these days, not because nature's gotten more evil or because the shrubs are trying to choke us. It's because of urban sprawl. And there's just so many people being pushed into these dangerous fire sheds. And the planning departments are failing in their job. Their job is to produce reasonable development plans and developments that are safe for us, and they're just not doing it. So give me an example of what's going on. Reference the whole thing about houses exploding. They don't explode, they burn, and here's how they typically burn in most of these fires. It's not a wall of fire, because fire sort of just stops when there's no more fuel to burn. The danger is something different. So here comes a fire, and the wind's blowing it, and off the flames come these little evil embers. Watch what happens. The tree takes one, the rest of them end up in Bob and Sally's attic, and that ignites the house. One of the worst possible things you can do, I'll show you in a minute, is to clear your property 300 feet all around, which is dirt, and that creates a bowling alley for embers. It's a physical thing that happens, and the house becomes a target now for the embers. And you notice that tree caught one of the embers. Well-groomed, properly maintained oak trees and trees of that type can actually protect your house from a fire, and that's not what people are being told. So there was a report after the Woods Creek fire that burned almost 1,400 homes, plus or minus. Virtually none of them burned because of direct exposure to flames. They were all ember ignited. And some about a mile ahead of the fire front, which is what happened in Santa Rosa. So this is in Santa Barbara. This was during the Cetus fire, I think, several years ago. That's not an accent light. That's an ember. And once the fire takes off and the wind starts going, that's where you're wonderful. That's the thing that's the danger. So these urban fuels, we like to call them, are really the problem. It's not necessarily the wildland. I know the fire is coming from the wildland, but at some point, most of us have a sense of value for those wild spaces. So if we want to protect our homes and our lives, well, you ought to start at the house and where we're living. Get rid of the Canary Island palms. People really get upset when I say that. And, but you know, that's what's taking out houses, and acacia and things like that. So this is what people respond to. And that's the only message they hear, is clearance, clearance, clearance. And defensible space is absolutely critical. There's no question about it. But after a certain point, you get diminishing returns. And we looked at almost more than 500,000 homes, my colleagues. And what they found was, in these fires, very little benefit goes beyond 100 feet of defensible space, even on slopes. Now you'll get people saying, that's ridiculous, I've seen X. Well, of course you've seen it. You know, my mother-in-law is 100 and something. She used to smoke. Okay, smoking's good for you? You know, so I mean, you know, this is what science is all about, right? You take all the information and come up with a conclusion, not just your anecdotal stories. And this is very difficult for people to understand. And they go and engage in all these logical fallacies about, well, I know such and such, and I've been in this field for 35 years. And here's the information. What are we going to do with it? You know. So you get a situation like this in Laguna Beach. This is literally a community designed to burn, and that's the danger. So ironically, most homes when we studied them that burned had not shrubs around them, but non-native grasses. And the problem with these things is they grow every single year right back to where they were the previous year. And that means you got to do every single year, you got to do maintenance. So my colleague Alex Seifert came up with these basic risk factors. You're probably familiar with some of these things. Homes that are older than 30 years old. The window frame issue, very important. You don't want plastic window frames, they've got to be metal. The heat can actually radiate into the house through the window and ignite drapes. The vegetation immediately around the home is important, especially trees or overhanging. It's not so much the trees, it's the stuff that gets into the gutters. And as you look at fires, you'll notice a lot of houses are gone, the trees are still there. And the ones that aren't got caught fire because the house burned them, not the other way around. So our response to a lot of these things is, let's go grind up the wildland. This is a place near Santa Barbara, and they got some fire safe grants to do these fuel treatments. And what happened was, this is what that looked like the previous year. The soil was disturbed. You've got these trees and shrubs now. It's they're little islands of things, and that's the way these people have convinced themselves that's the way Chaparral is supposed to look. It's supposed to be airy and spaced. And this clogged, shrub-choked landscape we've created by fire suppression. And so now what they've done, they've created an environment that's more flammable than it was originally because of these invasive weeds. And yes, it's easier to put fire out there, but yes, that's where most firefighters get killed, in grasslands, because you don't expect them to move as fast as they do, and there's all sorts of things. And everyone knows these things, but this intuitively feels like the right thing to do, even though scientifically it's just not the thing to do. So this guy looked like he did all the right things, even though the design component here isn't exactly what I would like to do. The house burned anyway. This is in the Poinsettia fire a few years ago in San Diego County. So what happened then? Well, we forgot the house, the flammable thing. So we've been trying to promote this notion about protecting places from the house out instead of the wildland in, which is the current approach. And so do everything possible to the house. ember-resistant vents, closed eaves, the proper kind of windows, non-flammable roofing, don't put wood fences up against the house, get your trash cans out in the other part of the yard, put your wood stack over there too, and all these little things. So this is basically a planning issue. So you start with the planning. So this is Santa Rosa, just north of there, in 2002. This little area here is the Fountain Grove area, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Coffee Park area that really got devastated across the 101 is over here. So in 1964, the Henley Fire started up there on Mount St. Helena and burned all the way across. Huge winds like they had last October, same story. So as a planner, you look at the history of the landscape and say, well, new landscape, current landscape, there's the Henley Fire, there's the Tubbs Fire. Same thing, except this time, you've got a whole community. Bullseye, ready to go. And the ironic thing is the community protested, told the city this was a danger. The city violated, apparently, according to the reports, their own ordinances, and they put them up anyway. So let's take a look at the Fountain Grove neighborhood where the end of that arrow is pointing. Just get a feel for what it looked like. That's it today. Every single house except this guy. I don't know exactly what happened, but you know, when you hear things like, I don't understand, the fire was so random. No, it wasn't. We know exactly why houses burn. And occasionally there'll be a windstorm or something that will get in the middle of something, and then maybe that's why that house survived.
Or maybe he replaced his roof.
Well, there's that. And actually that happened in Scripps Ranch in '03. There was a guy that wanted to change out his roof. And they had a community, what do they call those things? Yeah, homeowners regulations. Yes. You had to have shake shingle roofs. And this guy, he wanted it changed out. And they, I think he almost had to go to court, and he finally got the permission. He changed it out. 6 months later, the Cedar Fire hit. His house was the only house standing in a house of about, in a community of about 100 homes.
What did he change?
It was a tile kind of thing. Now, tile roofing isn't, you know, guaranteed because the embers get up into those vents.
You get those big shakes, those concrete
yeah, there's
shakes.
that.
Those work.
And so, you know, yeah, it's the only house that survived. Was it the roof? I don't know, but it's ironic.
Well, I lived in La Costa then, and our neighborhood, I don't know, 40, 50 houses burned. But if you looked around, my house was a shake shingle roof. That's why I was on the roof all night with a hose.
Yeah.
But the ones that had replaced with tiles, all of them survived, and all the shake shingle.
Well, it's just putting kindling on your roof, right? I mean, it's just it's amazing.
That's exactly what it was.
Can you explain, I mean, just at a high level, why this whole neighborhood did burn? What was kind of the...
Well, it was 70-mile-an-hour winds, and these embers are like 1 million killer bees. And it's basically taking a board and just going, you know, and just blasting those embers, and it's going to ignite.
So essentially, this neighborhood should not have been built?
No, it should not have been built. And I think somebody has a class action suit there really ready to go, because they were warned about this, and this happens time and time again. And these guys approve these things, and if there's political pressure, the builders, you know, I got my private property, I want to build on it, okay, fine. We're not going to come up to protect it and make sure whatever you do there doesn't ignite somebody else's house. And ironically, all these people that don't want any more regulations are the first one to call the fire department. You know, and they want our help. So anyway, it's a very convoluted political mess to deal with. But you know, what's going to be happening is some pressure points here, which we'll discuss, that maybe is going to force the issue, like it's forcing the issue in Houston and New Orleans with a different risk, which is flooding. Yes?
I'm noticing the vegetation actually looks relatively intact.
Well, it does, you know, and this is the thing you see all the time. I mean, this is where everybody was hanging out. This is the danger zone that they probably, well, let's clear it. And I would hazard to guess that's probably what's going to happen. They'll go in there and take it all out. And I've seen it more and more. And it never even burned.
And you look at it and you go, well, the interesting thing is, the vegetation has water in it.
Right.
All the wood in the house doesn't. It's all dry wood.
Well,
You know, it's made to burn.
it's interesting, the 2003 Cedar Fire stopped on Miramar, which is a military base. It stopped in 6-foot-tall chaparral. I mean, just dead stopped. There was a conservative radio jock down there that was blaming all of us on the fire department, and he said, well, and you know what, when the Cedar Fire stopped, it was stopped by the U.S. Marines, and they got paid a lot less than the fire department does, you know. Okay, first of all, that wasn't true. There were no Marines there. Second of all, the fire stopped by itself. And San Diego City Fire Department is probably one of the least funded departments, and realistically, arguably, one of the most fire-prone environments in the entire state. Okay. I mean, there are these stories that get passed on that just don't make any sense, but they stick in people's head because they're edgy, and people around how to use that kind of propaganda. So once we leave the planning department, what do we do with all these homes that are already there, right? And that's the big issue. So you pass a regulation, a state law, then within 10 years, they all have to retrofit and provide people low-interest loans that can't do it otherwise. First thing you do is take out these ember-sucking vents and put in these ember-resistant vents. They're pretty cheap. I did this in my house not too long ago. My house is a giant timber box. It was built in 1909 in a whole horrible fire shed. So I'm there, what am I going to do? So this is what I'm doing. And this is the thing that most people are not thinking about. It's not on the radar, but exterior sprinklers, not interior, exterior sprinklers. What you were mentioning, if you can get the environment humid enough and wet enough, it's not going to burn. Now this slide I showed in that previous presentation, and the lady said, well, that's not going to help because houses explode in fires. Well, I don't know how to help that. But this has been used in numerous areas. They do this in Australia all the time. We haven't gotten it. This is actually it's a picture of a camp in Australia.
It always amazes me that people have houses with pools, and the house burns down, you've got
There should be, I mean, this would be one of the regulations.
20,000.
If you have a pool, and if you're in a fire shed, you're required, along with your pool pump and your filter, to have an automatic sprinkler system that goes right up to the roof, and there's a thermocouple out there, and it kicks on the minute, you know, and it doesn't tap into the system's water pressure, it's your own system, you know. Your house will be safe.
Yeah.
So this is a system in case of emergency?
Yeah, yeah. And you know, I mean, either you stick around and push the button, or it does it automatically. You know? Now the thing with sticking around, there was talk about that a while ago. The problem is people think they're going to be brave, and they freak out, they get in their car, and they die. Most people get killed in these fires by running away from their house because they're, you know, they leave in time, or they're going to stand and defend, and they, you know, the fires are so loud and so hot, they're really scary. And I lived through this in 2007. I was a trained firefighter in the Forest Service. I'd confronted flames before, but I'll tell you, you know, my kids are in the house, there's fire coming over Bernard Mountain, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh. And your mind goes wild, and I kind of knew what I was doing. I stuck around, because one of the denominators of whether a house survives is whether there's somebody there putting out the ember fires. But it's not something the fire departments now recommend anymore. They were doing that for a while, but the Australian fires, I think in 2007 or 8 or 9 or something, really devastating. The lessons people learned from that. People just, you know, it's hard enough for the trained person to deal with it properly.
But the fire that you showed us, no one could have stayed.
Well, you know, we don't know enough about everything. That looks so devastating. It would have been interesting to have a time lapse of the whole thing. But honestly, in a situation like that, I don't know enough to know what would have worked. It looks pretty bad. Would all those things that I'm going to talk about here, would they have helped? Obviously the vegetation didn't burn, so it wouldn't have mattered if that was cleared off. So what was igniting the homes? It was the embers. Would there have been a possibility if these sprinklers were on every house? Could that have worked? I think probably.
Yeah.
The problem is in Santa Rosa they have notoriously low water pressure anyway, so this, if everybody's house is tapped into that, it wouldn't work anyway. So, okay developer, you need to have 10 2,000 gallon water tanks every block or something. and it's tied into the house. Well, that's gonna cost jobs, it's gonna. So from the house out means once you've taken care of the house, now start looking around. And when a fire lights up a palm tree, which has palm fronds that come off and burn the neighbor's garage, you don't trim up the palm tree and wait for it to burn the next time. That's exactly what happened here. You cut it down. I asked the fire chief down in Poway, why don't you guys get that rolling? He says, do you ever tell people about their palm trees? Yeah, but the minute I suggest something they really need to do, the phones start ringing in the city council, and I'm told to knock it off. So there's that. So fire officials, their hands are often tied in so many ways. So anyway, it's just crazy, some of this stuff. Then you do your vegetation management. You don't want to clear it down to the dirt. You can thin it out, taking all the deadwood out, and you can use community kind of vegetation management in defensible space areas. But what you don't want to do is disturb the soil, which ends up creating an environment which encourages weeds, which makes it more flammable than it was before. And so a lot of people bring in goats, or they bring in these giant chippers, and it just makes a mess. This is more expensive, but in the long run, all of this stuff happens once, or this management here happens every 5-10 years. You clear it, you don't do anything about the house, your maintenance is constant every single year. And they keep spending millions of dollars out in the wild landscape to create these fuel breaks, and there's places where they can help. But instead of focusing on that, flip it around and focus on the communities. So, any questions about any of that? We talked about it.
Yes. Because I've had this conversation with big people who think they know otherwise. So what you're saying is that, for example, like in Lafayette, there was a station fire. There's a lot of nonsense about, they should have been, clearing. So what you're saying is the brush is there, the chaparral is there. You can manage it by clearing dead debris. That's
around the structures.
But the normal, natural, rolling chaparral should be left intact, and it will actually serve to protect rather than to encourage.
Well, around your house, if you properly thin, that can help. But the wildland is going to burn hot, it's going to burn fast, and no, that's not going to protect anything. I mean, it's a flammable environment.
But for people who say, well, the firefighters should be, napalming all this stuff, it's...
Well, okay, let's go that route, and then what's going to happen? It's going to look like Riverside County. Miles and miles of weeds. And if you don't think a grass fire can cause damage, in 2005 or something, the Texas Grassland fires, 1 million acres, killed more than 12 people. Okay, and you can have one of those every single year. At least in this situation, typically it takes a few years for the vegetation to get to the point where it'll carry a fire. So now then people say, well, there you go, then just get rid of it. Well, you keep doing it every 2 or 3 years, you eliminate the chaparral, and now you have weeds. So, and the ironic thing about the station fire, again, the newspaper, I should put that one in my presentation. They blamed the Forest Service because they hadn't done their prescribed burns. Well, and the guy in the Associated Press who reported this talked about the prescribed burns they were contemplating were miles away from where the fire started. The article said it wouldn't have started in the first place. Yes, it would have. And the second place, it would have burned. It wouldn't have mattered. There's not enough money in the world to destroy all the habitat up there, even if you wanted to. And it's going to grow back anyway at some point. It just doesn't make any sense. But see, people think that because that's where the fire's coming from. It's like there's no agency called CalQuake, running around trying to prevent earthquakes. But people think Cal Fire is supposed to do fire prevention. No, they administer a fire-prone environment in a way that will help protect lives and property. And that's what they do. They don't stop fires.
At CNPS this week, they were talking about trying to fight the Cal Fire proposed program. That's a giant program.
The vegetation treatment program.
Supposedly 60,000 acres a year. They're going to try.
Well, it's just I've been working on this for like 12 years. It's like a bad penny.
Yeah.
And, you know, the problem is, though, statutorily, they're supposed to manage rangelands and forests. They're really not supposed to be protecting homes. That's not really their domain, and it's, over time, it's changed, and that's what they really have to start focusing on. Change their objective from stopping fires to protecting lives and property. And those are two different questions with two different answers. All right, let's move on to the future environment. So this is your graph we were looking at before, and I would just want to focus on the last 100 years. So there's climate projections based on climate change, and this is what we've got. So by 2100, you've got some pretty severe drought conditions. We've got an uptick right now. You think the last drought was bad? If the predictions carry through, this next one's going to be twice as bad. Predictions are there's going to be a number of cities or towns in the Western Sierras that are just going to have to shut down because you can't afford to turn the water up there. San Diego probably will have to have a drought-based migration unless they get on the desalination plan pretty quick. There's just not going to be enough water. So by 2050, we're going to have probably some pretty heavy-duty mega droughts. The mean drought cycle will be lower than the most extreme cycles for the last 1,000 years. So we haven't seen anything yet. The Office of Emergency Services is going to be probably the most important department in the state of California before too long. So what does this mean for chaparral, since that's what we're talking about? I don't usually show this slide to people that are not older, because younger people, it gets them very depressed. But again, these are projections. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. But based on the current scenarios, there's two possibilities. There's a wet and warm one and a hot and dry one. The hot and dry is what most of us are thinking is going to be happening based on the data. The red areas are places where chaparral currently is that cannot exist anymore. And the blue areas are areas that will be compatible with chaparral. So chaparral is partly heading north along with the fire. So that's what we're looking at here. And probably you're going to get some pretty serious extirpation of forests. These islands in the San Bernardinos and the lagunas, these island forests will probably long since be gone by the end of the century. And all of our hand-wringing and protecting the trees and the tree people and everything, it feels good, but for the most part it's, kind of stiff in the wind. So that's what we're dealing with. So how do we confront that as a society? And I don't think we've done that yet. And we got a little backpedaling here in the last year. So I don't know what the future is going to hold. But there are some lessons in the past. And that's why I wanted to bring up the Anasazi. Have you all been out to Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly? There's some really remarkable ruins out there. Nobody really asks, why did they build in those? Why do you think they built in those caves like that? Protection from what?
Water.
Protection from each other. Water and grain supplies were absolutely critical. You think about the refrigerator now, we don't really go there anymore, but there'd be groups of people like in those dystopian novels you read or Mad Max, raiding parties. You had to protect your stuff because if you didn't, the arid landscape wasn't capable of supporting you. Well, they confronted this situation just like we did. They had a pretty big drought in 1180. That's about when Chaco Canyon, if you're familiar with that, it was kind of in a canyon bottom. It was a big pueblo. That's when those people bailed because of that. About then, and they bailed and they went into these things. About that time, that's when these people, okay, we're out of here. We can't deal with that. So they went up on the mesa tops. The next drought coincided to another historical event. You know what it was? Spaniards, yeah. That double dose of disaster did the culture in. And ultimately, that whole Anasazi population was extinguished. And the descendants of the Hopi and probably some other groups too. So just remind you, this is where we worked in comparison to what happened in the past. Now, we're not living in caves on cliffs, but this is a important warning call, I think, to all of us to really start considering what's our future. So, on that kind of note, there's 4 main points we probably try to emphasize here, because you can't remember all this stuff, right? Chaparral is our native habitat, and it's a valuable thing. And if you value biodiversity, and not a lot of people do, who cares if the red tip goes extinct? Well, I don't know. It's a value to me. I think it's important. I think for all of you too, because you love native plants. And that's a message that has to be communicated. And we can start by changing these national forest lands into Chaparral recreation areas. Chaparral is threatened by too much fire, as is sage scrub. So the challenge is to keep fire off this mountain over here for at least 30 more years, which is going to be tough because there's going to be areas that are going to get filled in with weeds really quick. And it depends a lot on the soil too. Some soils are not amenable to weeds as much as others. And I'm not familiar with the soil types here, but we'll see what happens. But anyway, that's an issue that most people don't recognize because they think chaparral needs to burn, it's good for fire, because you keep hearing these messages. And again, it's a little more complicated. And you got to reduce the risk of fire from the house out. And that's kind of a simple phrase. It would be something to put on bumper stickers and stuff. Put it in those packets to the elementary school teachers with the toy on vows. And then lastly, we want to plan for the future from the future. That same fire official I was talking to, we're good friends, we drink beer and everything together, but we really got into it for a while. And I said, look, your fire career, what you learned the last 30 years, means nothing. When you're looking at the future, things are going to shift so fast, so quick. We've got to take the knowledge you've got now and realize there's going to be some major shifts here. It's like living in Houston and New Orleans. I mean, what we used to think was going to work, like the levees in Sacramento, they're probably not going to work. So what do we do to fix that? We can't think about what happened. We got to think what's happening in the future based on our best predictions. And those may or may not be good anyway. So those are the 4 take-home points. And it's wonderful being here. Anybody have any killing questions you can't wait to tell me or ask me before we depart? Yes?
I have a question that may not be related. I camped out for several days on one of the Channel Islands, and I was told that there are no yellow flowers on that island.
No yellow flowers?
Never part of the mainland as a plant that you don't see on the mainland. Are you familiar with that?
You mean, are they talking about the Coreopsis? What they say to you?
No yellow flowers.
Which island was it?
I'm sorry. I believe it was Santa Rosa.
Geez, we'll go back in the spring. There's yellow everywhere. What a weird thing to say.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
Yeah. Well, they weren't botanists.
Well, there you go. I mean, I don't know how anybody has a good time without being a botanist or a geologist. Seriously. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I heard that from someone else who was speaking one time that if you clear more area than you really need to, that sometimes, and you don't have the vegetation in that area, that sometimes it'll increase the amount of the wind speeds and,
yes,
and wind going towards those buildings.
Yeah, this happens in forests, and which is an issue that seems to be ignored sometimes by people who promote forest thinning. When you do remove vegetation, you allow for the wind to flow through easier. So yes, wind speeds increase. So it's funny, we think we know things based on our logic, because it does make sense. Well, let's remove the stuff that's burning, and it's often counterproductive when you do that. Yes?
So, protect what we have. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're on. It's your spot.
Protect what we have. Okay, we have something like the Earl King. Is there the ability for us to add to the chaparral by utilizing native plant?
Well, if I had $1 million and I was asked that question, I'd start buying land up and protecting what's already there.
Right, but I mean, that would be the first thing, but
yeah.
Is there any possibilities of trying to restore anything?
there's some wonderful folks in the Forest Service that are doing some restoration projects. It's very expensive, very labor intensive, and that's where the money thing comes in. So, for example, take a look at the front country of the San Bernardino Mountains, not here, but further east, or maybe that's southeast. Anyway, it's just a sea of grass. Okay, are there selected areas there that we might want to restore? I think mostly for cultural values, in terms of letting people enjoy natural habitat, because of the little islands, and then of course animals will come in. On a limited basis, probably, yeah. In some areas that are next to somebody, I guess you could probably make a rationale for restoring areas that are near communities that people can enjoy. You know, trying to restore an area that's been wiped out in the distant landscape out there probably isn't going to make it. So that, I don't know.
Well,
if
it
that
doesn't
helps
sound
you.
like in the future there's going to be much possibility.
Well, that's the other thing, right? I mean, you know.
Cruel reality.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, there was a fire, the Sierra fire in the Chibuco Ranger District, right at Santa Ana Mountains, right above Corona. And there's a beautiful grove of Tecate cypress there. So a fire came through and it just hit that same grove again. The time span between the two is probably 10 years now. So the Tecate cypress grove there is in trouble. But, you know, we had there's always meetings after fires, lots of meetings, you know. And one of, you know, there's the fire people there and then wildlife people there. And I just made this suggestion. I said, how about paving that road that goes up through that Tecate cypress grove, create a space for firefighter safety, put a fire station down here, and make the developer who wants to develop this to pay for it. And the wildlife people came unglued. You can't pave that road. It's going to just, okay, 10 years, you're going to lose all this stuff you're trying to protect right now anyway. Why not allow this to be designated as a special endangered, special habitat that you ask the fire agencies, would you, I know life and property is the most important thing, but if you got some extra water and you got time, you got a road up there, you got a safety place, try to keep that environment from burning, because if it burns in the next 30 years, we're in trouble. Well, it did, you know. So that's the other thing, we got to think out of the box. And so, yeah, you can probably do things that protect some places, you know. But at some point, yeah. That's why I think buying landscapes and not giving them to the government, maintaining them in a private, non-profit organization. Because what we found in the past, and I've always been worried about this, is I forget what the group was, but they bought a whole bunch of desert land out there by Yucca Valley, gave it to BLM, now they're putting solar panels on it. I mean, the community donated money to buy the land to protect it for the plants and animals, not for solar panels. And then, you know, as we're noticing, used to think federally protected national parks at least would be protected. So anyway, I'm thinking there's alternative models for that too. Anyway. So I have a book. It's a great book, has my picture on the back. And has all this great information. If you want to pick up a copy, you can. Or if you want to join my organization, there's a form there, and I can give it to you. It's a free gift when you join. How's that for salesmanship? So anyway, and if you want to find out more answers or you have more questions about things, our website's got a lot of research papers you can download. And I've only gotten in trouble once for that. But they're available. Do you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Yes?
If you didn't live where you live now and you were going to move and you wanted to be in an area where there was lovely wildlands and chaparral,
Yeah.
where would you go?
Oh, where would I go?
In light of climate change.
Yeah,
How long are you thinking you're going to live?
It's best days in this room.
You know, there's some beautiful chaparral in the Rogue Valley in Oregon.
That's what I was thinking. Get to Oregon, man. Let's get there.
Yeah, there's in the Monterey area, back in the hills, the Big Sur area, there's some beautiful places. But yeah, I don't want to I don't generally like people anyway, so I don't want to meet any more people. I'm in my house, I know a few people, I got friends. I'm just going to stay there for the duration, I think. But that's a great question, you know. Because when people retire, they go, what do I do? Well, I don't know, move to Oregon. That's the last thing they want, right?
Is the Eastern Sierra Chaparral also? Like I was just recently.
Yeah, the Eastern Sierras. Yeah.
Is that considered chaparral?
Yeah, the Eastern, you know, it's, there's chinkapin and there's stuff that's, it's a shrubland, you know, it's kind of chaparral-like. It doesn't have that Mediterranean kind of, and there's a desert influence there. Yeah, there's some species there that we have in similar. But it's more of a...
It's more like a Great Basin sage.
Yeah.
Transition zone.
But I'm thinking about when I'm backpacking and going up, there's this zone in there where it's...
Yeah, where the chinkapin...
Yeah, and it's not really chaparral. I like to claim everything chaparral. I have to be careful.
We're talking southern Sierra, right?
Yeah, on the western side, there's lots of chaparral.
You're talking about like when you go over Canada.
Independence,
That's
yeah.
Great Basin sage.
Great Basin sage scrub. Then you go up and there's a little shrubland transition zone, and it's not really chaparral, but it has some chaparral components.
It really, I mean, even, you know, like if you leave Lone Pine and head up towards Whitney, you know, you go through the Alabama hills, and as soon as you get up there, it's a transition zone, but it jumps into the forest.
Yeah, it does pretty quick,
Because
doesn't it?
those are really steep, you know, so boom.
I just, whenever I see shrubs, I go, oh. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.
We have 2